Hi! Our second release of 2023 includes drag and drop from one control to another, a grid that loads new records smoother and handles filters better, the ability to specify which Java you want assigned to each project in your IDE, and a lightning-fast batch program processor called TurboRun that's going to cut your batch runtime significantly. So let's take a look at those. Drag and drop lets a user grab an item in one control and drag it to a different location and drop it into another control. For instance, they can choose a product from a list in a grid and drag it over to an order sheet, like this screenshot here. We've added this functionality by generating message drag and message drop events, so you can choose to fire one or both events for the controls. We're going to look at this later on in a demonstration. Now, the load-on-demand grid type updates the behavior of the grid so that a user can scroll through unlimited records very smoothly. A predefined number of records are loaded dynamically as the user scrolls, not page by page, like in a paged grid, and not all at once before the grid is even displayed, like in a plain grid. A new grid filter type uses an entry field instead of a checklist box, so you can search for a string rather than having to handle multiple checkboxes. The old method on the left required the user to check or uncheck multiple boxes for a range of values. The new filter type, shown on the right, allows you to enter something like the word Eric, and it'll bring up all of the records in the grid that match that string. A new property lets you display asterisks in place of sensitive information inside a grid. For instance, if you want to display a social security number in a grid and only let certain people with special permissions see it. The bitmap raw height and bitmap raw width properties were added to be compatible with isCOBOL. Now, previously you could get this information using $image size. And you would view these properties when you load images and you want to make sure that they fit in the bitmap control on your screen. That's useful if, for instance, you allow the user to choose a picture from their computer to display, or if a screen is resized and you want to handle that bitmap manually. And we're going to look at this later in a demonstration too. Now, in prior versions, when you displayed an image in a bitmap control, you used $scale to stretch or resize it to fit. Now you can also use $scale to leave it the same size and display it in a specific place inside that control, like centering a smaller bitmap in a larger bitmap control. And we're going to see that in a demonstration later. Now you can choose a specific Java version and installation to use for each project in your IDE. For instance, on the screen in Project 1, you can see that it's using Java 8, and Project 2 is using Java 11. We have a couple of new compiler switches so that isCOBOL can handle data the same way that other COBOLs do. -CCMF for microfocus type handling of numeric literal parameters that are passed in a call statement, and -CMC for COBOL IT type moves to variables with different picks and lengths. Now, some compile switches are set by default, and we've added a few to that list in 2023 R2. These switches improve performance and compatibility, and they rarely need to be moved. However, if you do need to remove them, you can put a -NO in front of the option. The four switches that are set automatically are the -B, which treats characters as written in string, unstring, and spec statements, instead of converting them to Unicode strings, as isCOBOL automatically does. -CGHV lets the runtime use group host variable names in ESQL instead of the individual subordinate items when possible. -G includes SMAP information so that if an exception occurs, COBOL source code references can be returned in the exception message. And -OE optimizes evaluate statements by converting them to Java switch statements whenever possible. And here's an example of a command line that turns off the -B switch by putting -NO in front of it. Now, as always, you can get information about a class, including the compile switches used, by running isCOBOL-info. In 2023 R2, we've added information in a compiled on area with the compile date and time. You can get the same information programmatically with a new function, compile-info. There's some code there on the screen for it. And you can see this information while you're debugging with the new -class_info parameter of the display command. So you would type display space -class_info in the command prompt area of the debugger. isCOBOL is unique in offering multiple opportunities for regular expression and preprocessor changes to your code. So you can change your COBOL code before it gets converted to Java without having to make physical changes to your COBOL programs. Now, as an example, you can write a COBOL program to change all your display statements to call $write_log lines so that your program writes to a log file instead of the console. Now in 2023 R2, we've given you a choice of which code to view in the debugger, the original source code or the code after the pre-processing is done. Now here's what it would look like in the example that I mentioned. On the left is the original code with the display statement, and on the right is the pre-processed code with the call $write_log. There are 3 new configuration variables that we've added for compatibility with Micro Focus COBOL and with AccuCOBOL. Now one is for truncating environment variables accepted to the first low value. One is for different ways of handling the mapping of a COBOL data item to the data type of an existing database field. And one is to choose how many bytes to use when storing pic-n characters or national characters in a double byte character set. You would set it to false for Micro Focus COBOL compatibility and true for AccuCOBOL GT compatibility. We've added a new method in the isCOBOL class so that your Java program can check to see if a COBOL program exists before it calls it. And the new TurboRun feature improves performance when you're running numerous batch programs, one after the other. Instead of starting up a new instance of the Java virtual machine every time you start a program, TurboRun uses the application server technology to execute each of the batch programs inside of the same JVM. It keeps it active from the beginning to the end. We're going to see how that saves time in the demonstration in a little bit. There are several library routines specific to the application server, and they all start with $. One of these is $userinfo, and you can use this to set some custom information. This custom information displays, for instance, in the user information column of the application server panel, like you see on the screenshot. Now, $userinfo's clear opcode can now clear the custom information for a given thread ID instead of being limited to the current client's information. And previously, you needed to call one of the $user routines to get the thread ID, and then you had to call $userinfo to get the user's custom information. Now you can do it in one step. The $user routines can return that custom info. And you can use $userinfo and $getuser to see if a thread ID is still valid. Now, if the TID isn't valid, these routines will return a -2. The EDBI routine for SQL Server has changed the way that it writes the COBOL record key to be more in line with standard SQL code. And when creating a new relational database table, sometimes you want not null on all of your fields, and sometimes you don't. Now you can force the database bridge to generate code that sets each field as not null with the -NN compiler switch, or the not null columns EasyDB compiler configuration variable. In EIS, the display text method has a new signature that specifies a MIME type. The default MIME type is still text plain, but if you build XML or JSON streams using the string statement instead of our internal runtime classes, those are the ones that use the isIdentified clause in your data description, you can still use the corresponding MIME type, either text XML or text JSON, to get a better text display. And you see the text plain for a JSON up there in the top. And then when you set text JSON, you can see how it's a more clear display. We've added the ability to change the font in 4 of our utilities: the Application Servers panel, the JDBC to FD tool, the isCOBOL launcher, and the isMigrate utility. We've also changed the icons in the Application Server panel to use Font Awesome icons. It gives it a more modern look, and it better integrates it with the web client. So let's go look at some of those changes. I'm going to run the samples program and we'll look at the new features area. So here's the new features for 2023 R2, and the first one is drag and drop. Make this a little bit bigger for you. So we have a grid here with a list of articles, and we have an order sheet. And I can click on one and drag it across and drop it, and another, etc. I can click and drag it back if I don't want it. And so both of these grids here have the message drop and the message drag enabled. Now there's an entry field down here, and I cannot click and drag something down to it because it doesn't have the message drop. But I can add something like this, and I can drag it up to the grid, and then I can purchase it. So the entry field has the message drag, but not the message drop. The grids have both. Next one is a grid load on demand. Now this grid has 100 records that have been fetched. And you watch the indicator over here in the slide as I scroll down. When it gets to about 80%, then it's going to load another 100 records. It does that because the runtime kicks off a message load on demand event, and then the program loads another 100. So we can continue going down, and you'll see it pop up and get another 100, and another, etc. So it's a very smooth experience for the user. Here's a grid with the filter types that we talked about. So this filter here is an entry field, and I can do something like type YEL and filter out everything except Yellow Submarine. Same with the artist. I'm going to type in Eric to get all of Eric Clapton's songs. And the old type of filter is still available. So for instance, this genre, this is the old type of filter. And so if I just want, say, the blues, I can get it that way. So those are the two different types of filters that are available to you on the grid. Now I also want to show you the $W scale. So let's go to that under Library Routines and $W scale. And you can see that we've preloaded it with an image. And right now it's stretched to fill the bitmap control. But let's load a smaller image. So I'll click here and go out and find a smaller image. And you can see that with the stretch style, it doesn't look good at all. So I could resize it, but actually I just don't want to resize it at all. So this is the new feature. You can click on None, and that is setting the $W scale to not scale it at all. And then we'll reload the image with this button. And voila, it looks nice again. And I can change where I want it to display. If, for instance, I want the top left, there it goes. Okay, so those are some of the new features. Let's take a look at the IDE. And I have two projects here. And under Window and Preferences and Java and Install JREs, I've set up all three versions of Java that I want to use for different projects. 11, 17, and 8. So I'll close that. And now I can right-click on the Java runtime and go to Properties, and I can choose which one of those Java versions to use. So, for instance, I could just keep the default, which is 17, and perhaps this one I want to change it to 8. Okay, so we're going to test the TurboRun. To mimic a multi-program batch run, I'm going to run the Hello World program 10 times. And the first time is the way that you would normally do it with isCRun, and I'll show you that script. So we're going to run it for 10 times, isCRun Hello World. Now remember, every time isCRun starts, it starts a new JVM, and when it stops, it kills that JVM. So I'm going to run that, and I'm going to time it. There's our 10 hello worlds, and it took 3.5 seconds. All right, now we're going to do the same test with TurboRun. And to do that, I've started the application server with a -TR switch for TurboRun. And you can see here it's been started, and it's listening on a default port of 10995. And let's clear the screen. And we'll take a look at the TurboRun script. It's the same script as the other one, except we're using trun instead of isCRun. We'll run it, and you can see it's much, much faster when you don't have to stop and start that JVM each time. So there's your in-depth look at what's new in 2023 R2. Please give it a try. And if you have any questions, send us an email at support@variant.com. Thank you.